When my 4-year-old daughter vanished, my ex-wife cried to police. He's a dangerous father. He probably hurt her. Officers believed her. My mother-in-law shook her head and said, I always knew he'd ruin this family. Then a tiny voice spoke from the hallway. Officer, should I tell you where Mom really took my sister? But before I begin, I want to make an important announcement about our channel. For the past 5 months, our channel has not been monetized, which means I am not earning any money from YouTube ads. There are currently no ads running on our videos. Because of this, I also have to work another job, which makes it difficult for me to upload videos daily. If you enjoy our content and want to support the channel, please consider donating just $1. $1 may seem small, but if everyone supports together, it can make a huge difference and help keep this channel active. Your support will help me spend more time creating stories and uploading videos consistently instead of working another job. Of course, you can donate any amount you would like, and every donation truly helps and means a lot to me. To support the channel, please click the donation link in the video description or pinned comment. You can also scan the QR code shown on the screen to donate quickly and easily. Thank you so much for supporting. Now, let's dive into today's story. Brett Callahan pulled into his driveway just after 7 in the evening. The sky above Columbus a deep bruised orange. His truck smelled like cut grass and engine oil, the way it always did after a long day on a job site. He sat there for a moment before cutting the engine, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the faint hum of the neighborhood settling into dusk. A sprinkler was running 2 houses down, throwing a slow arc across somebody's front lawn. A dog barked once and went quiet. From inside the house, he could hear the television. A cartoon, Lily's laugh, high and bright, cut through the front window like something that cost nothing and was worth everything. He smiled in spite of himself. That single sound made everything else bearable. Brett was 42 years old and had spent the better part of his adult life building 2 things, his family and his business. Callahan Landscaping had started with a second-hand mower, a truck he bought on a payment plan, and a client list that fit on a single sheet of paper. That was 20 years ago. He had been 22, working out of his parents' garage, leaving flyers in mailboxes, and taking every job that came in, no matter how small. Aeration, mulching, spring cleanups that left him with blisters on both hands and a sunburn across the back of his neck. He had not complained about any of it, because the work was his, and the results were his, and nobody could take that from him. 20 years later, he had 12 full-time employees for trucks, commercial contracts across 3 counties, and a reputation that kept the phone ringing without advertising. He was proud of that, genuinely proud, the kind of pride that sits quietly in a man's chest rather than announcing itself. He did not need people to know what he had built. He just needed to know. His marriage to Mallory had grown alongside the business. They met when he was 23 and she was 21 at a mutual friend's backyard party on a summer night, so humid the air felt thick enough to hold. She had been laughing at something when he first saw her, leaning against a fence post with a plastic cup in her hand, and he thought she was the most alive-looking person he had ever seen. They had talked for 3 hours without stopping. He called her the next day. They married at 25. They bought a house at 27. Ava came 3 years after that. Red-faced and furious, Brett had told the story 100 times, like she arrived already annoyed at the world. Lily came 5 years after Ava, small and quiet and watchful, the kind of baby who seemed to be taking notes. For a long stretch of time, the life they had built together felt solid. Not perfect, solid. The way a well-built structure feels solid. Not because nothing ever shakes it, but because when things shake it, it holds. Then stop feeling that way. Brett noticed the changes the way you notice water damage in a wall. Slowly at first, then all at once. Mallory's phone was always face down on the counter. She took calls in the garage, closing the door behind her. She lost interest in dinners together, in movies on the couch, in the small talk of shared life. When Brett asked how her day had gone, she gave him 3 words and walked away. He stopped asking. He told himself it was stress. He told himself marriages went through seasons. Everybody said so. Every couple he knew had gone through stretches like this. He worked longer hours because the work made sense, because the work responded to effort in a way his marriage no longer did. You put labor into the ground, and something grew. You put labor into a conversation and got a wall. He was not a man who gave up easily. He tried. He suggested they see someone, a counselor, a therapist, anyone. Mallory said she would think about it and never brought it up again. He planned a weekend away for their anniversary, and she went through the motions like she was completing an obligation. He cooked dinner she used to love. He came home earlier. He tried, quietly and without making a show of it, for most of a year. Then, one evening in late February, he found the messages. He had not gone looking. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while she was upstairs running Lily's bath, and the preview sat on the lock screen long enough for him to read it. Just a few words, but they were the kind of words that do not require context. He picked up the phone. She had not set a passcode. He had known the pattern unlocked for years, and she had never changed it. He scrolled back further than he should have. He stood in his own kitchen, beside the refrigerator that hummed its steady note, the overhead light casting the room in its ordinary evening yellow, and he read. The affair had been going on for nearly a year. The man's name was Derek. He worked in property management and drove a silver sedan and had a habit of sending messages late at night when he was apparently alone. There were photos. There were plans for a trip they were going to take, plans for a life that had apparently been discussed in detail. There were messages so casual in their intimacy that Brett understood something very clearly. This had not been a moment of weakness. This had been a choice, made deliberately and remade dozens of times across dozens of conversations. He set the phone down exactly where he found it. Face down. He walked outside, stood in the driveway in the dark for a long time. The neighborhood was quiet. The same dog, as always, barked once from down the block. He stood there until he felt cold, and then he went back inside. He sat on the floor of the living room with Lily for the rest of the cartoon. She leaned against his leg and pointed at things on the screen and laughed, and he watched her laugh, and he thought, she is 4 years old. None of this is her fault. Not one single part of it. When he confronted Mallory that night, after the girls were asleep, he kept his voice level. He laid out what he had seen. He was specific. He asked her directly what she wanted him to say or do next. She did not apologize. She crossed her arms and stared at a point on the wall, just past his shoulder, and she said, "You care more about that business than you ever cared about this family. Don't act like you didn't see this coming." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's what you're going with." She said nothing. He walked out of the room. 3 months later, she filed for divorce. Brett hired an attorney the same week. He had told himself throughout that terrible spring that once they were legally separated, once the process had structure, things would get cleaner, more predictable. Two people dividing what they had built and moving forward separately. He understood divorce was painful. He was prepared for that. He was not prepared for what she was actually planning. The first mediation session lasted 40 minutes. Mallory arrived with her attorney, a woman named Patricia Vance who spoke in short, precise sentences and rarely blinked. Brett sat across the polished conference table from them. His own attorney, a quiet, methodical man named Phil Donahue, beside him with a yellow legal pad and a pen he kept clicking. The mediator, a retired judge named Holloway, laid out the standard framework in a tone that suggested he had done this 800 times and found no particular drama in it. Patricia slid a document across the table without preamble. Brett read it carefully, read it again, laid it flat, and looked at the summary at the top of the last page. She wanted the house. She wanted primary custody of both girls with Brett, receiving supervised visitation on a schedule she would propose. She wanted 50% of Callahan Landscaping, not the earnings, the business itself. She wanted the savings accounts divided, the retirement accounts divided, child support calculated at the upper end of the state formula, and a spousal maintenance arrangement. Phil leaned slightly toward Brett and said, very quietly, "Don't react." Brett set the document down. He had built Callahan Landscaping from nothing. Mallory had never worked in the business. She had attended one company event in 20 years, a summer cookout for the crew, 5 years prior, where she had stayed for an hour and left early. She had never met with a client, never managed a contract, never stayed up until midnight going through payroll, or made a 5 a.m. phone call when a crew member didn't show. The business was not a shared asset in any meaningful sense. It was the product of 20 years of his labor, and she wanted half. "We're prepared to discuss a fair settlement," Phil said across the table. Patricia arranged her papers and said, "We believe this is fair." The mediation ended without progress. The second session produced the same result. The third was canceled by Mallory's side with 24 hours' notice. She was not there to negotiate. She was there to establish a position, and the position was that she was entitled to everything. Brett started noticing other things around that time. Their joint checking account had been touched, 3 separate transfers he had not authorized, each just under a threshold that would have triggered an automatic alert. He caught them because he checked the account himself, something he did every Sunday morning. He called the bank immediately, flagged the transfers, and had the account frozen within the hour. Then he called Phil. Phil filed a motion. He also retained a financial investigator, a man named Dennis Marsh, who arrived at their first meeting carrying a battered briefcase and speaking in the flat, deliberate cadence of someone who had learned long ago that numbers do not lie and therefore preferred them to people. Marsh started pulling records. What he found over the next several weeks was a pattern. 2 credit accounts had been opened in both their names. The balances had been run up and paid down in ways that obscured the flow of money until you traced each transaction individually. Some of it went to household items. Some went to travel. Some of it, Marsh laid a printout on the table without comment, went directly to an account associated with Derek's home address. Brett sat with that information in Phil's conference room and did not say anything for a long time. The window behind Phil looked out over a parking garage. A pigeon was sitting on a concrete ledge in the cold. He had been working 12-hour days to build the financial foundation their family stood on. She had been quietly taking from it for over a year while telling him he wasn't present enough. He put the printout in the folder and told Phil to use it however he needed to. Mallory's mother, Denise Porter, had been a constant presence since the divorce filing. She had never been warm to Brett, civil, most of the time in the polite and effortful way of someone who has made a decision about a person and is simply waiting for events to confirm it. She was at the house often now, her car in the driveway 2 or 3 evenings a week. She accompanied Mallory to appointments. She was on the phone with her at all hours. Ava told Brett one evening during his parenting time, carefully watching his face while she did, that Grandma Denise had said Daddy was going to lose, that he was going to lose the house and the business and custody, and they would all be better off. Brett heard this and felt something tighten in his chest. He made himself smile. When did she say that? Last weekend. She didn't know I was listening. Ava paused. She says stuff like that a lot. When she thinks I'm not in the room. Don't worry about it, Brett said. He meant it as much as he could. He had made a decision early in the process. A firm, considered decision he returned to every time he was tempted to deviate from it, that he would not speak negatively about Mallory in front of the girls. He would not ask them questions about what happened at her house. He would not use them as messengers or informants or emotional proxies. He would show up every single time, be present, be steady, and let the process work. He had believed then that the process would work. He still believed it. But the process was slower than he had expected, and in the meantime, Mallory and Denise were not standing still. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in late October. Brett was on a commercial job on the east side of Columbus. New sod installation for a corporate campus, 3 crews working in sections, the kind of job that required him to be in 4 places at once. The afternoon had been cool and efficient, the work going well, and he was just beginning to think about packing up for the day when his phone buzzed with a number he recognized as Lily's daycare center. He answered immediately and stepped away from the noise of the equipment. The administrator's voice was careful, chosen in the way people choose their words when they are trying not to alarm anyone. She explained that Mallory had arrived at 1:15 that afternoon and signed Lily out early. This was within her rights under the current parenting arrangement. Lily was with Mallory this week, and Mallory had the right to pick her up at any time. But the administrator had tried calling Mallory twice regarding an upcoming field trip and hadn't been able to reach her. She was calling Brett as the secondary contact just to confirm everything was fine. Brett thanked her and hung up. He called Mallory. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He sent a text. 2 words. Where's Lily? No response. He stood at the edge of the job site and thought about this for a moment. Mallory took Lily places without telling him regularly. It was one of the minor frictions of the split schedule, the kind of thing that irritated him, but that he had stopped escalating because the escalations were always more draining than the irritations. He told himself this was the same thing. She had picked up Lily and taken her somewhere, and her phone was on silent or she was busy. He drove home, showered, made dinner. Ava was with him that evening. The girls were on a split schedule pending the final custody ruling, and she came downstairs and sat at the kitchen island and talked to him about a history project while he cooked. He made pasta and listened and answered her questions about the Civil War as best he could, and the evening felt ordinary enough that he let himself believe everything was fine. At 7:40 that evening, someone knocked at his front door. Not a casual knock, the kind that expects an immediate answer. 2 officers in uniform stood on his porch, hats on despite the cool night. A third man in a dark jacket stood slightly behind them, hands in his pockets, the posture of someone who comes to these situations often enough that he has learned to distribute his weight evenly and show nothing. Brett stepped onto the porch and pulled the door almost closed behind him. Through the narrow gap, he could hear the television still on in the living room. Brett Callahan, the detective said. That's me. I'm Detective Roy Castillo. We're here about your daughter, Lily. Brett looked past them toward the street. Mallory was standing at the edge of his driveway, beneath the streetlight, her arms pulled close to her body. She was crying in the way she had always cried when she wanted something from people. Quietly, shoulders drawn up, face turned slightly down so the tears caught the light. It was a performance he had seen before, in arguments and in apologies both, and he had believed it both times. He did not believe it now. Mrs. Callahan has reported Lily missing, Castillo said. The word landed hard. Brett felt his chest compress. Missing. She was signed out of daycare this afternoon and hasn't been located since. Mallory signed her out, Brett said. We're aware, Castillo said. We'd like to ask you some questions. Do you mind if we come inside? They sat in the living room. Ava had appeared at the top of the stairs at the sound of the voices. She was 9 and had the instincts of someone older. She always knew when something was off in the atmosphere of a room. Brett looked up at her and kept his voice calm. Hey, go back to your room. Everything is fine. I'll explain later. She looked at the officers, then at him, and did what she was told, her bare feet quiet on the carpet as she withdrew. The questions started as paperwork and became something else in the second half. Had he picked up Lily at any point that day? No. Had he made arrangements with anyone to collect Lily outside the parenting schedule? No. Could anyone confirm his location between noon and 5? Yes, his site manager and 11 crew members who had been with him on the commercial job all day. Did he and Mallory have a difficult relationship? He paused one beat. Yes. Through the living room window, he could see Mallory on the sidewalk, no longer crying, speaking with one of the uniformed officers in a tone that looked measured and composed. Denise had arrived. Her car was parked behind the patrol vehicle, and she was standing close behind Mallory with one hand at the small of her back, speaking in the officer's direction with the composed, emphatic posture of a woman reciting something she had memorized. Brett watched them, and something shifted in his understanding. A door opened in his mind, and everything that had been accumulating over the last several months walked through it. Castillo told him what Mallory had said, that Brett had become controlling and threatening after discovering the affair, that he had said on multiple occasions that he would take the girls before a court got involved, that she feared he was unstable and capable of hurting them. Brett looked at the detective steadily. None of that is true. She says she has people who can corroborate the threat. She has her mother, Brett said, which I'd argue is the same thing. He kept his voice level. He did not lean forward, did not raise his hands, did not give Castillo any physical reason to read him as threatening. He had worked very hard for the last 7 months to be the most boring, predictable, composed man in any room related to this divorce. He was going to keep doing that. Then Ava came down the stairs. She was in her pajamas, the ones with small stars on the bottoms, slightly too short now, because she had grown 2 inches since last spring. She walked to the edge of the living room and looked directly at Castillo with a clear, deliberate expression of someone who has made a decision and is not going back on it. "Mom isn't telling the truth," she said. The room went quiet in a way that rooms rarely do. Even the television seemed to drop in volume. Castillo turned toward her slowly. His voice was careful, easy, the tone of someone who has interviewed hundreds of children and understands that gentleness is the only useful currency. "Can you tell me what you mean by that, sweetheart?" Ava stood with her arms at her sides. She did not look at her father for permission or reassurance. She said what she had come downstairs to say. "I heard Mom this morning on the phone with Grandma Denise. I was in the hallway, and she didn't see me. She said Lily was going to Karen's house. She said the name of the town. Waverly. I remembered it because it's the same name as a character in my show." Castillo was very still. "When was this?" "This morning. Before school. Maybe 7:30. Brett said nothing. He looked at the window. He could see Mallory framed in the glow of the streetlight, and he watched the precise moment she stopped crying. The way a light goes off when the switch is thrown, not a gradual dim, just off, and he watched her face go through something fast and complicated and land on a look he had never seen on her before. She looked frightened. Not for Lily. For herself. Denise had gone still too, her hand frozen at Mallory's back, her chin lifted slightly in the way of a person who has just heard something they cannot unhear. Castillo stepped outside. He was on the phone for several minutes. When he came back in, he told Brett they would be following up on the information and asked him to remain available. He thanked Ava in the same gentle voice and told her she had done the right thing. After they left, Brett locked the front door. The neighborhood was quiet outside. The streetlight was still on. Mallory's car was gone. He turned back to his daughter, who was standing in the middle of his living room in her two short star pajamas, looking at him. He did not have adequate words, so he just crossed the room and hugged her, and she let him, and that was enough. Detective Castillo had done this long enough to move quickly when the information was specific. Waverly was a small town in Pike County, about 90 miles south of Columbus. Not a common destination. Not the kind of place a person ended up by coincidence. The name, combined with the name Karen, was enough to begin with. Officers were dispatched within the hour. Lily was found at the home of a woman named Karen Hollis, 38, a resident of a small ranch house on the edge of town. She and Mallory had met 2 years prior through a fitness class Mallory had briefly attended at a gym she no longer belonged to. They were not close friends. They were the kind of acquaintances who texted occasionally and remembered each other's birthdays on social media. Karen opened the door when officers knocked and said, almost immediately, "She told me he was dangerous." She stepped back without being asked and let them into the living room. Lily was on the couch in her socks, a bowl of crackers in her lap, watching a movie about animals. She looked up when the officers came in and said, with the complete composure of a 4-year-old who sees no reason for alarm, "Hi." She was unharmed. She was warm and fed and had been told by her mother that she was going on a special visit to Aunt Karen's house for a little while. She did not know she was missing. She did not know there were police officers at her father's house 70 miles away. She just knew the movie was getting to a good part. Officers took a brief statement from Karen Hollis that night and a longer one 2 days later. What she told them was consistent in both sessions. Mallory had called her the previous week and explained that things with her husband had become frightening. She had said Brett was unpredictable and that she needed somewhere safe for Lily to stay for a few days while she dealt with the situation. She had asked Karen not to tell anyone. When the officer asked if Mallory had said anything else, Karen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "She told me it would help with the custody case." She said she needed to show the court how serious things were. The officer wrote that down. Brett received a call at 10:47 that night. Lily had been located and was safe. She would be returned to him. He sat down on the couch when the call ended. Ava was beside him, close, the way she had been all evening, not clinging, just near, maintaining contact the way children do when they're trying to help and don't have the tools for it yet. He put his hand on top of her head. "She's okay," he said. "Lily's okay. She's coming home." Ava exhaled, and it was a slow, shaky breath that told him she had been holding it since 7:30 that morning, since the hallway outside the kitchen, since the moment she had heard her mother say something that didn't make sense and had filed it away until she needed it. I knew where she was the whole time, Ava said quietly. I just didn't know if I was supposed to say. Brett turned to look at her. She was looking at the carpet, turning the hem of her pajama top in her fingers. You were absolutely supposed to say, he said. You did everything right. Do you understand that? You did exactly the right thing. She nodded. She looked like she might cry. And then she didn't, and he understood that she was more like him than he had fully realized. Lily arrived just before midnight, carried in by a female officer who handed her over on the front porch with a look that said she had been doing this for a long time, and it never fully stopped being hard. Lily was half asleep, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit, a brown and white thing she had named Biscuit, who had been through every nap and illness and bad night Lily had ever had. She saw Brett and made a sound that was almost a word and buried her face in his shoulder. He held her on the porch in the cold for a long time. The officer waited respectfully. He did not care. He stood there with his 4-year-old pressed against him, her small weight solid and real, smelling of someone else's laundry detergent and crackers, and underneath, it all still entirely herself. And he felt something in him that had been clenched all evening slowly release. He put her to bed. He sat at the edge of her mattress until she was asleep, the stuffed rabbit under her arm, her breathing slow and even. He looked at her sleeping face and thought of everything Mallory had been willing to do. To this child, to both of them, in the name of winning. He stood up and turned off her lamp and walked out of the room. The anger was there. He was not going to pretend otherwise. It was real, and it was large, and it was cold the way serious anger always is. Not hot and impulsive, but steady and clear-eyed, the kind that does not exhaust itself. He acknowledged it the way a man acknowledges a tool. It was there, it was useful, and he was going to keep it in hand. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water until after 1 in the morning. Then he went to bed. The morning was going to be early. In the weeks that followed, Phil Donahue's office became the kind of place where serious, quiet work got done. Dennis Marsh had been at it since before October's events. Now, with the police investigation running parallel to the civil proceedings, the pace of discovery accelerated. Documents were subpoenaed. Financial records were examined. Phone logs were requested and received. Each new piece of information connected to others in the way that a real pattern always does. Not artificially, not because someone is trying to make a case, but because the underlying events actually happened and left evidence behind. The joint account withdrawals totaled $42,300. Marsh had traced every dollar. The story the money told was not complicated. A series of transfers over 14 months, each one sized to stay below the threshold that would have generated an automatic alert, each one timed to coincide with weeks when Brett was especially busy with the business and less likely to review the accounts in detail. It was methodical, patient, the kind of plan that requires sustained effort over a long period of time. Brett had thought she was checked out of the marriage. He had not understood that she had been actively working against him for well over a year. The credit accounts were worse in their own way. 2 lines of credit, opened in both names, which meant his liability on each, run up across 18 months to fund a life that had nothing to do with him. Hotels in Pittsburgh and Cleveland. Restaurants he had never been to. A weekend trip to a resort in Asheville that he now understood she had taken with Derek while telling him she was visiting a college friend. He did not tell the girls any of this. He barely spoke about it to anyone outside of Phil's office. He carried it in the way he had learned to carry difficult things, not in his words or his face, but somewhere lower, somewhere he could set it down and pick it back up without letting it run loose. The phone records arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Phil called Brett into the office and laid the printout flat on the desk between them. In the 7 days before October 23rd, Mallory and Denise had exchanged 43 calls. Most were between 2 and 8 minutes. 3 were longer. The final call, placed at 7:22 on the morning of October 23rd, the morning Ava had stood in the hallway and listened, ran 31 minutes. 31 minutes. Brett looked at the printout for a long time. He thought about Ava standing in that hallway in her school uniform, backpack already on, just happening to hear her mother discuss where her sister was going to be hidden. He thought about the weight Ava had been carrying since 7:30 in the morning until the moment she walked down the stairs in her star pajamas and said what she knew. He set the printout down. "What do we do with this?" he asked. Phil, who had been doing this for 30 years and had learned long ago that clients sometimes needed him to simply be direct, said, "We put it in front of the judge." There was more. Mallory's attorney had submitted a package of character statements to the court, 7 written accounts from friends and acquaintances describing Brett as controlling, emotionally withholding, and volatile. Phil had reviewed each one carefully. The similarities in phrasing across several of the statements were notable. The dates on which the statements had been finalized were more notable. 6 of the 7 had been signed within the same 14-day window, 5 weeks before the October incident. One woman, a neighbor named Donna, was contacted by Phil's investigator as part of routine discovery and admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that Mallory had provided her with a handwritten draft of the statement and asked her to review and sign it. She had signed it. She had not thought much about it at the time, she said. Looking back, she felt differently. Phil noted this in the record. Another woman, who had attended a gym class with Mallory, confirmed that she had received a call from Mallory asking if she would write a statement saying that Brett had seemed aggressive. She had declined. She said Mallory had called 3 times before stopping. Brett sat across from Phil and listened to all of this laid out in sequence. Then he said, "She was building a file against me. She started before October. She was planning all of it." Phil looked at him. "That's what the evidence suggests, yes. How long has this been going on?" Phil considered. Based on what Marsh has found and the timeline on the statements, she likely started building this case in early September, 6 to 8 weeks before October 23rd. Brett nodded slowly. September, when Ava was starting 4th grade and Lily was just settling into her daycare routine, when he was going to the busiest stretch of the landscaping season, when he had been genuinely occupied with keeping his business running and had been paying less attention to the legal maneuvering than he probably should have been. She had used that. She had used his work schedule against him. He felt the cold anger settle a little further into his chest. He said nothing more about it. He just looked at Phil and said, "Let's make sure none of this gets buried." The custody hearing opened on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of November. The family court building in Columbus was not dramatic. It was a mid-century concrete structure with low ceilings and hallways that smelled of floor polish and something institutional underneath it. The accumulated residue of years of difficult human situations being processed through rooms that never quite aired out. Brett had been here twice before for procedural hearings. He knew where to park, knew which elevator worked reliably, knew to arrive at least 15 minutes early. He wore a navy suit, a white shirt, a dark tie. He had gotten a haircut 2 days prior. Phil had told him early in the process, "Look like a man who is stable, organized, and serious. Not flashy, not casual. A man who shows up ready." He sat in the 2nd row behind his table and watched the room fill. Mallory entered with Patricia Vance and took her place at the opposing table. She wore a dove-gray dress and had her hair back, simple and composed. She had been coached well. Her hands were folded, her posture was upright, but not stiff, and she kept her eyes on the table in front of her rather than scanning the room. She did not look at Brett. He noticed this because he was watching everything. Denise settled into the gallery directly behind her daughter. She was wearing a dark blazer and an expression of composed disapproval that she had apparently decided was the appropriate face for a courtroom. She met Brett's eyes once, briefly, and looked away first. The Honorable Judge Claire Wakefield entered and the room stood. Wakefield had been on the family court bench for 16 years. She was a small woman who moved without hurry and carried herself with the authority of someone who does not need to perform authority, because she simply has it. She reviewed the filings on the record, addressed both attorneys in turn, and made clear at the outset that she had read the entire file. "There are some unusual elements to this case," she said. "We'll address them methodically." Mallory testified first. She was on the stand for nearly 2.5 hours. Patricia walked her through the marriage with care. The distance, the long working hours, the way Brett had responded to the affair with what Mallory described as cold rage and escalating threats. She described a man who had told her that no court was going to take his children from him. who had said this repeatedly and with increasing edge as the divorce progressed. She described feeling afraid to be alone with him. She described October 23rd as a day when she had felt she had no options, when she had panicked, when she had made a poor decision out of genuine fear for her daughter. She cried on cue and recovered on cue. Patricia's pacing was precise. She gave Mallory the moments she needed and moved her along before the emotion had a chance to settle into the room and get examined too closely. Brett sat at his table and watched without expression. Phil was patient. He let the testimony run its course. He let the courtroom absorb the performance. Then he stood with a single manila folder and asked his first question. Mrs. Callahan, when you removed Lily from daycare on October 23rd, did you notify Mr. Callahan beforehand? No, she said. Did you inform the daycare that you intended to take her to another county? I didn't think it was necessary. You drove Lily approximately 90 miles from Columbus to Waverly. You left no information with the daycare about your destination. Is that accurate? I was upset. I wasn't thinking clearly. You arranged the visit with Karen Hollis in advance. Is that right? A pause. I called her yes. How far in advance? Another pause. Longer. A few days. A week. Patricia objected. The judge overruled it. Around that, yes. So the arrangement was planned approximately a week ahead of time, Phil said. Not a panic decision on the day. Mallory looked at the table. I was worried about my daughters. Phil opened the folder. Karen Hollis provided a sworn statement saying that you told her it would help your custody case. Did you say that? Patricia was on her feet. The judge sustained the objection on form, but told Phil to rephrase. Did you discuss the custody proceedings with Karen Hollis when you made arrangements for Lily to stay with her? Silence. Mrs. Callahan, I may have mentioned them. Phil moved on to the financial records. Marsh had organized them into a clean exhibit, dates, amounts, account numbers, and a summary table on the final page. Phil did not editorialize. He walked through each item in sequence and asked Mallory to confirm or explain. She confirmed what she could not deny and claimed not to recall what she could not explain. The credit account payments to Derek's address she described as a loan to a friend. Phil asked when the loan had been repaid. She said she didn't remember the exact date. He asked if she had a promissory note. She said she didn't think so. Judge Wakefield made a note. The phone records came in next. Phil laid the timeline on the record. 43 calls in 7 days. The escalating frequency. The 31-minute call on the morning of October 23rd. He asked Mallory what she and her mother had discussed that morning. Family things, she said. For 31 minutes. We talk all the time. My mother is my support system. Phil looked at the exhibit and said nothing for a moment. He let the silence do some work. Then he sat down. Judge Wakefield had been writing steadily throughout. Now she set down her pen and looked at Mallory directly. Her voice was calm and entirely neutral, and somehow that made it worse. Mrs. Callahan, I want to ask you one question directly. Why was your daughter in another county, in the home of an acquaintance, before you reported her missing? The courtroom went still, completely still. Mallory's mouth moved. Patricia leaned over and whispered something. Mallory straightened and said, I was protecting her from her father. From what specific danger? I was afraid of what he might do. The judge looked at her for a long moment. You had filed no police reports describing threatening behavior prior to October 23rd. You had obtained no protective order. The statements you provided to the court were prepared within a 2-week window, and your daughter was placed in another home before you contacted anyone. A pause. What you did have was a custody hearing scheduled for 3 weeks later. Mallory sat with her hands in her lap and said nothing. The judge closed her notepad. We'll resume tomorrow. The question of whether Ava would testify had been argued between the attorneys for 3 weeks. Phil's position was that her account was directly material to the most contested factual issues in the case. She was the only person other than Mallory and Denise who had direct, contemporaneous knowledge of what was said and planned in the hours before October 23rd. Without her, those 31 minutes of phone calls were circumstantial. With her, they had a witness. Patricia's position was that subjecting a 9-year-old to testimony in custody litigation concerning her own parents was harmful regardless of the content. She filed a motion to exclude. The judge denied it, but ordered a protocol, a session in chambers between the judge, Ava, and an appointed child advocate to assess Ava's understanding and willingness to participate. No attorneys present. No parents. Ava was in the session for 40 minutes. When she came out, she found Brett in the hallway and sat next to him on a wooden bench that was slightly too high for her feet to touch the floor. She swung them a little, looking at the wall across from them. She just wanted to make sure. I knew I didn't have to if I didn't want to, Ava said. What did you tell her? Brett asked. Ava thought about it. I said I wanted to, because I know it's true and I think it should count for something. He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, feet not touching the floor, absolutely certain of herself. It counts, he said. The testimony was conducted under careful conditions. The witness box was not used. Instead, a chair was placed at the front of the courtroom at floor level. The advocate sat next to Ava. Non-essential observers had been cleared. The judge conducted the examination herself. No attorney was permitted to question Ava directly. Ava sat with her hands in her lap and answered every question clearly. She described the morning of October 23rd. She had been getting ready for school. She had come downstairs to get her lunch from the refrigerator. Her mother was in the kitchen on the phone, speaking in the low voice she used when she didn't want the girls to hear. Ava had not hidden. She had just been quiet, moving slowly, not making herself known because she was still waking up. She had heard her mother say Lily was going to Karen's house. She had heard her mother say it was just for a few days. And then the judge asked her to repeat this part slowly, and Ava did. She had heard her mother say, if Brett loses custody, we get the house. The courtroom was silent the way large rooms rarely are. Not the silence of people holding their breath. The silence of people who have just heard something settle into place, the last piece of something clicking home. The judge looked at Ava without any readable expression. Did that sentence mean anything to you when you heard it? Ava considered this honestly the way she considered most things. I didn't know what custody meant exactly. I thought maybe we were going to move. I thought maybe Lily had to go somewhere else to live. And now that you understand more, the judge said, what do you think it means? Ava looked at the judge directly, without looking anywhere else first. I think it means she wasn't scared of my dad. I think she was just trying to win. And Lily was how she was going to do it. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then the judge thanked Ava, told her she had shown real courage, and dismissed her. The advocate walked her out. Ava did not look at her mother on the way past. Not defiantly, not pointedly. She simply looked forward with the focused composure of someone who had done a difficult thing and was finished with it. Mallory was looking at the table. Denise had her hands folded in her lap, and she was very still in the way of someone who has just run out of options. Brett sat at his table and felt something he could not fully name. Not triumph. There was nothing triumphant about any of this, about what his daughter had been made to carry, about the courtroom and the costs and the long months of holding everything together. Something quieter than triumph. Something more like the feeling of ground under your feet after a long time of not being sure it was there. He looked at the table and breathed. In the corridor, during the recess that followed, Patricia Vance approached Phil. They spoke for less than 2 minutes. Phil came to Brett afterward with an expression that managed to be both neutral and communicative. She wants to discuss a settlement. Brett straightened his jacket. No. Phil nodded once. He had expected this answer. He folded his notepad under his arm. Let the judge decide, Brett said. That's what we're here for. Detective Castillo had continued his work in parallel with the civil proceedings, building a case file that grew steadily through October and November. He was a methodical man. He did not make assumptions, and he did not rush. He had interviewed Karen Hollis 3 separate times, each session longer than the last, because he had found over the years that the third conversation is often when the details that matter most appear. Karen was not a bad person. She was a woman who had been told a story she believed, and had made a choice she was now rethinking thoroughly. She cooperated fully. The text message record between Karen and Mallory went back 11 days before October 23rd. Castillo read every message. The picture they painted was not of a frightened mother reaching out to a trusted friend in a moment of crisis. It was of a woman walking a trusted friend through the logistics of a plan that had already been decided. When Lily would arrive, what Karen should say if anyone asked, how long it would need to last, what the purpose of it was. Mallory had been explicit in one message, sent at 11:18 p.m. on October 19th. It just has to look like I had no choice. Castillo had that message printed, dated, and logged. The device was the next discovery. Mallory had used a tablet connected to the household wireless network, a device she had apparently forgotten existed or forgotten that her usage history on it could be recovered. It had not been listed in the discovery process because it was an older model that had been sitting on a shelf in the spare room for the better part of a year. Castillo's technical investigator pulled the browsing history. Beginning in the first week of October, 3 full weeks before Lily disappeared, Mallory had run searches that included child custody, what constitutes danger, how to document domestic threats, filing police report against husband before custody hearing, parental kidnapping charges, how do they work, false sense of emergency custody, and what happens if mother hides child briefly. She had visited legal forums. She had read articles on family law websites. She had, in one session, spent 22 minutes on a forum thread specifically discussing the use of emergency custody motions to improve positioning in contested cases. She had done the research. She had known, before she made a single move, exactly what she was constructing and what she wanted it to accomplish. Castillo presented his file to the county prosecutor's office in late November. The prosecutor, a precise and experienced woman named Linda Rourke, reviewed the file with her team over 3 days and scheduled a meeting with Castillo at the end of the week. She asked 2 hours of careful questions. She reviewed the text messages. She reviewed the search history. She reviewed Karen Hollis's statement in full. She agreed to proceed. The charges were serious: filing a false police report, custodial interference, and providing materially false information to law enforcement in the course of a criminal investigation. Rourke was not interested in charging symbolically. She was interested in the record reflecting what had actually happened. Mallory's criminal attorney, Gerald Finn, was a practical man. He had seen cases like this before, and he understood the mathematics of them. When Rourke's office made contact, he requested a meeting and was given one. He sat across from Rourke's team for 90 minutes and asked precise questions about the strength of the evidence and what the office was looking for in terms of a resolution. What he heard in that meeting was apparently not encouraging. He went back to Mallory and told her what the realistic options were. She did not take the information well, by all accounts, but she had spent months building a case against her husband on the premise that she could control the story. The story was no longer hers to control. Denise Porter retained her own attorney within the week. Her role, the phone calls, the coordination, the scripted presence at Brett's house that night, the coaching, was documented well enough that Rourke's office was considering whether to fold her into the existing charges or pursue a separate matter. The attorney-to-attorney conversations that followed produced a certain degree of cooperative information sharing from Denise's side. Phil briefed Brett on all of this in December, in the same conference room where they had spent so many hours over the past year. "The criminal case is moving," Phil said. "Finn is in talks with Rourke about a plea. Given the evidence, he's almost certainly going to recommend she take it. Trial is significantly worse for her." Brett had his hands flat on the table. He had lost weight in the last 2 months. Not dramatically, but enough that the collar of his dress shirt sat slightly differently. He had been eating less because he had been thinking more, and thinking had a way of crowding other things out. And Denise. Reduced charge. She's cooperating. She won't see a cell, but she'll carry a conviction, and she'll be in the record. "Good," Brett said. One word, no inflection. Not satisfaction, just acknowledgement of a result that needed to happen. He drove home that afternoon in his truck, the heater running, the city going past in its ordinary way, traffic lights, storefronts, the gray Ohio sky. He thought about the last 14 months. He thought about what it had cost him in money and sleep, and the particular specific exhaustion of being accused of something you didn't do and having to prove you didn't do it to people who did not start from a presumption of your innocence. He had not buckled. Not once. He had shown up for every hearing, every meeting, every school conference, every bedtime, every morning before school, every dentist appointment, every Saturday afternoon at the park when the weather cooperated, and every Saturday afternoon at the kitchen table doing puzzles when it didn't. He had been a father in the full, daily, unremarkable, essential sense of the word, while simultaneously fighting in a courtroom for the right to keep being one. Nobody could take that from him. Not the savings, not the legal fees, not the long nights, not the accusations. None of it had changed what he was. He pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment before getting out. The lights in the house were on. Through the living room window, he could see Ava at the kitchen island doing homework. He could hear, faint through the glass, Lily's voice talking to one of her toys in the way she did. A full, complicated, running narrative that she maintained for hours, and that he found inexplicably comforting. He got out of the truck and went inside. Judge Wakefield issued her family court ruling on a Friday morning in January, when the ground outside Columbus was frozen and the trees along the courthouse parking lot were bare against a sky the color of old pewter. Brett arrived early, as always. He sat at his table with Phil and kept his hands flat on the surface in front of him. He had learned over the months of proceedings to read a room's atmosphere, and what he read this morning was the particular quiet of a process that is nearly over, the sense that the machinery has finished its work and is about to deliver its result. Wakefield began with the findings of fact. She moved through them methodically, in the precise language of the bench, citing the record at each step. She noted the financial misconduct, the unauthorized withdrawals, the credit accounts, the pattern of redirection. She noted the coordinated character statement campaign, the timeline of its preparation, the documented evidence of coach content. She noted the phone records. She noted Karen Hollis's testimony. She noted Ava's testimony at significant length. She described it as credible, internally consistent, unimpeached on cross-examination, and, she used this word carefully, important. She noted that the court's obligation in any custody matter was to the welfare of the children above all other considerations, and that the testimony of the children themselves, when credible and when properly protected in its collection, carried real weight. Then she delivered the ruling. Brett was awarded primary physical custody of both Ava and Lily, effective immediately. Mallory was granted supervised visitation on a structured schedule, subject to conditions that would remain in effect until a review in 12 months. A family services coordinator would be involved in monitoring compliance. Judge Wakefield looked at both parties before closing. This court's first obligation is to these children, she said. The record in this case reflects a sustained pattern in which their welfare was made secondary to strategic considerations. Actions were taken that exposed them to confusion, instability, and the particular burden of being used as instruments in a legal contest between adults who should have known better. That is not a basis for awarding custody. It is a basis for restricting it. She gathered her papers. The room stood. Phil slid a notepad across the table. He had written on it, about as complete as it gets. Brett looked at it. He nodded once. He did not allow himself to feel the full weight of it yet. The criminal case was still open. There was still work to do. The criminal proceeding concluded 6 weeks later, on a Monday morning in mid-February. Gerald Finn had negotiated a plea arrangement with Rourke's office through the end of January. The negotiations had been extended and at times contentious, but the weight of the evidence produced a result. Mallory appeared in the courtroom of a criminal court judge named the Honorable David Engel and entered guilty pleas to 2 of the 3 charges, filing a false police report and custodial interference. Judge Engel reviewed the file methodically before accepting the plea. He asked Mallory the required questions. Did she understand what she was admitting to? Did she understand the consequences? Was she entering the plea voluntarily? Had her attorney advised her fully? She answered each question in a quiet, composed voice, her eyes down. Then he sentenced her. It was not the maximum. The plea had accounted for that. But it was real time, in a real facility, with a real conviction, the kind that follows a person through background checks and licensing applications and custody reviews for years to come. The judge did not deliver a speech. He read the sentence in the flat tone of a man performing a function, and the function was justice, and it was done. Denise Porter had entered her own plea 2 weeks earlier to a reduced charge of contributing to a custodial interference proceeding. She received a fine, a period of probation, and a formal finding in the family court record. No incarceration. But she was in the record, and the record did not forget. Brett stood when Mallory's sentence was read. Courtroom protocol. He watched her stand across the room, gripping the edge of the defense table. He watched the marshal approach from the side door. He watched her turn once in the moment before she was guided out. A brief turn, almost involuntary, the way a person looks at something they're leaving behind and will not see again for a long time. She looked at him. He held her gaze. Not with heat, not with contempt, with the steady, clear, entirely level look of a man who had absorbed everything she had thrown at him and was still standing in his suit with his hands at his sides. Every bit as composed as the morning she had stood on his sidewalk, crying while the officers knocked at his door. The door closed behind her. Brett walked out of the courthouse into a cold February afternoon, his breath showing in the air, the city moving around him with complete indifference. Phil came out beside him and extended his hand. Brett shook it. "It's done," Phil said. Brett looked up at the sky for a moment. Then he walked to his truck. Spring came the way it always does in Ohio. Tentatively at first, with cold weeks and fall starts. And then one morning you walk outside, and the air has changed, and the mud has started to dry, and the ground smells like things beginning, and you understand the long part is over. By April, Callahan Landscaping was running at full capacity. The legal fees had made the first quarter financially tight, tighter than Brett had experienced since the early years, but his crew had stayed, every one of them, and the commercial contracts had held, and when the phone started ringing in March, they did not stop. He was on job sites by 7 most mornings, managing logistics and walking properties, and doing the physical work he had always found clarifying, the kind of labor that asks nothing of you except your attention and returns something honest in exchange. He had not rebuilt from scratch. He had kept most of what he built. That mattered. Life at home had a different texture, quieter in some ways, more deliberate, less performance. He and the girls had developed rhythms that were theirs entirely, things that belonged to the three of them without any outside pressure. Tuesday evenings were for whatever Ava wanted to do, because she was the older one and had spent a year being more adult than a 9-year-old should have to be, and he wanted her to have something that was just hers. Usually it was a board game or a movie. Once it was baking a cake from a recipe she had found online that required 8 steps and produced a result that was technically a cake. He had eaten 2 pieces. He had spent a Saturday in March converting Mallory's old home office into a proper bedroom extension for Ava. Bookshelves along one wall, a real desk with a proper lamp, a reading chair by the window that Ava had chosen herself from a furniture store, deliberate and certain in the way she was about most things. She had sat in every chair in that section of the store before selecting the green one. He had not rushed her. Lily had been 4 and was now 5 and understood very little of what had happened and was troubled by none of what she didn't understand. She asked about her mother sometimes in the direct, simple way of small children who have not yet learned to wrap their questions in protective padding. Brett answered honestly, in the simplest possible terms. Mom was going through some hard things. She would be back in Lily's life when things were better. He said it without anger, because anger would have done nothing for Lily, and because on some level, a level he did not announce, did not examine too closely, he understood that his daughters would eventually need a version of their mother. He would not poison that well. Not for Mallory's sake. For theirs. He thought about Mallory sometimes, usually late at night when the house was quiet and he was sitting at the kitchen table with the last of his coffee. He thought about who she had been when they met, and he thought about the gap between that person and who she had become, or perhaps had always been underneath. He did not have answers. He had stopped looking for them, because looking had never produced anything useful. What he had instead was the present. The girls asleep upstairs, the business growing again, the long Ohio spring pressing forward outside. It was enough. More than enough. On a Saturday in late May, he loaded the girls into his truck and drove east to a state park about 40 minutes from the city. They had been there once before, years ago, when Lily was still a baby in a front carrier, and Ava had run ahead on every trail, calling back to them to hurry up. He remembered that day, without quite meaning to, the weight of Lily against his chest, Ava's voice ahead of them through the trees, the uncomplicated warmth of an afternoon that asked nothing of anyone. They found a bench overlooking a wide lake that caught the afternoon sun and scattered it across the water in moving pieces. The air smelled like pine and warm stone and something faintly green and alive. Lily ran immediately toward the water's edge and crouched in the mud, examining something in the shallows with the intensity she brought to all investigations. Ava sat beside Brett with her shoulder against his arm and said nothing. A couple walked past with a dog. Two older men were fishing from a dock 30 yards to their left, their lines still in the water, talking to each other in the low, unhurried way of people who have fished together for years and no longer need full sentences. A group of teenagers somewhere behind them were throwing a frisbee with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Somewhere across the water, a bird made a sound that carried clearly in the still air. The world doing what the world does. Brett sat and let it be. He thought about the last year, not with the grinding, sleepless replay that had characterized too many nights between October and February, but with the quieter acknowledgement of someone looking back from the far side of a difficult stretch. The money it had cost, the sleep it had taken, the specific, exhausting experience of being accused of something false and having to build your defense from nothing but the truth while the machinery of the accusation ran ahead of you. He had held. Every part of him that needed a hold had held. He had not become bitter. He had not become reckless. He had not taken the shortcuts that had tempted him, the angry responses, the public accusations, the impulse in his worst moments to fight the way she was fighting, to match her tactics with his own. He had chosen, repeatedly, to be the man his daughters could depend on, and that choice had cost him in the short run and built everything that mattered in the long one. The truth had come from where he least expected it. Not from lawyers, not from investigators, not from the financial records that Dennis Marsh had painstakingly assembled. It had come from a 9-year-old girl in star pajamas at the top of a staircase, who had been quiet in the right hallway at the right time and had chosen, without hesitation, to say what she knew. Mallory had spent a year building a case against him. In the end, her own daughter had built the case against her. He heard Ava say something beside him and came back to the bench, the lake, the afternoon. Dad! He looked at her. Her face was turned toward the water, watching her sister. In the afternoon light, she looked like herself. Not younger, not older, not defined by anything that had happened this year. Just Ava, the person she had always been before any of it, still intact. Yeah. Are we done with court now? He smiled. It was the kind of smile that doesn't require explanation, the kind that comes from somewhere lower than the chest, something warmer and more tired and more real than ordinary happiness. Yeah, he said. We're done. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, good, because I was really tired of the way that building smelled. He laughed. An actual laugh. The first one and he couldn't remember how long. Floor polish, he said. And something under it I could never identify. Yeah. She leaned a little more into his arm. I don't want to go back. We're not going back. From the water's edge, Lily's voice rose sharply. Dad, come here. Look what I found. She was holding up a stone, flat and round and smooth, gray and perfect. Brett stood. He walked to her, and she pressed the stone into his palm and looked up at him with complete trust that he was going to do something excellent with it. He turned in his hand. It had good weight to it, the right thickness, edges worn smooth by years of whatever the lake had done to it. He wound up the way his uncle had taught him when he was 8, body sideways, arm low. He sent it flat across the surface. It skipped 5 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, each one lower and faster than the last, until it disappeared into the lake with a small, clean sound. Lily threw her arms up. 5. I counted 5. Ava, still on the bench, clapped. Brett turned back to them and saw them both, his daughters, his people, the thing he had refused to lose, and felt the full weight of the year release out of him in a long, slow breath. He thought of the woman who had tried to take all of this from him. Not just custody, the whole structure of his life. The credibility he had earned. The business he had built. The identity of being a father. His daughters looked at the way Lily was looking at him right now, with the uncomplicated confidence that he was there and would stay there. She had planned it for months. She had enlisted allies. She had placed her own daughter in another county, stood on his sidewalk with practiced tears, and told police officers he was dangerous. She had done all of it and believed the machinery of accusation would carry her past the truth. It had not, because the truth does not require lawyers or investigators or forensic accountants, though those things help. The truth requires one person willing to say it. It required a 9-year-old who happened to be quiet in a hallway at 7:30 in the morning and who had understood, even then, even without fully understanding the words, that something was wrong and that she was the only one who knew. Lily was already scanning the bank for another stone. Ava had pulled a book out of the bag she had brought. She always had a book. She had always had a book. She had been carrying books since she was old enough to hold them, and he hoped she never stopped. She had tucked her knees up and opened it and was reading in the focused, total way she read, the rest of the world falling away. Brett sat back down on the bench. The sun was warm on his face. The lake was moving quietly, the last ring from the skipping stone long since gone. He still had his daughters. He still had his business. He still had himself. The version of himself he had chosen to be, month after month, in every room where it would have been easy to become something worse. Everything that had been taken could be replaced, and everything that mattered most was right here beside him, reading a book, chasing flat stones, alive and whole and entirely his.